Hello everyone, and welcome to this special USCA News video podcast. My name is David Duncan. I head up USCA News, the world's specialist provider of news and intelligence related to the world's water challenges. Our guest in today's videocast is Dr. John Matthews, who is co-founder and secretariat coordinator of the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, AGWA. He and I talk about the intersects between water and climate and the growing global awareness of water as the great connector in discussions about climate change policy, not least in the context of United Nations initiatives, including the historic Paris Climate Accord and the annual COP Global Climate Conferences. Let's get on with the show. Hello everyone, and welcome again to an USCA News webinar podcast. We're excited to welcome today John Matthews, a good friend of USCA News, who acts as the co-founder and secretariat coordinator for the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. John is joining us by satellite link from Oregon today. We are broadcasting from the USCA News Edinburgh, Scotland studio. Happy to have you join us again. John,
thank you.
Good to see you. You have a lot of exciting things going on. I know you, but many of our viewers and listeners may not. Perhaps you could take a moment to describe your background and AGWA and your role in the world of water.
Sure. Thanks for the invitation, David. I really appreciate it. It's good to be on your video cast. So my name's John Matthews, and by training, I'm a water scientist and aquatic ecologist. I've been working on climate change and water issues for almost 15 years now, since around 2002, 2003. And I primarily from the perspective, to begin with, about sustainable natural resource usage, and particularly how we think about climate impacts and climate adaptation. I worked for a number of environmental NGOs, and as an individual, I actually became really frustrated pretty early in my career. I felt like a lot of the work that I was trying to support in countries like India and China and Brazil on climate adaptation was very, at the project level, that there were larger forces that were really important about national and global policy, about finance, about how the natural resource management community, whether they were scientists or people that were actually making decisions about protected areas, were not actually involved in many of the conversations with other relevant groups, cities and farmers, and even energy companies to try and coordinate their activities. And I got a timely call in 2010 from a friend, and he said, almost like a matchmaker, I have a colleague at the World Bank who is organizing a small meeting just before World Water Week in Stockholm, and he's interested in very similar issues. He's an economist, not an ecologist, and I thought that your list of contacts and his might actually be quite complementary and relevant. We met, and I kind of brought our lists of colleagues, friends, and contacts from around the world. About 30 people or so, 35 people came to that first meeting in 2010. And at the end of it, in trying to describe the scope of the problem and the scope of the solutions that we felt like were available to us, we recognized that we had a lot that was really in common, that we needed each other, that we were often working in isolation as individuals or even institutionally, and that many of us had insights into different parts of these programs, much like I was seeing in my own work. as a project support, technical support person, and that we could actually benefit from being able to collaborate to join our knowledge together. And that day in 2010 is how AGWA, Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, was really founded. That colleague, Diego Rodriguez, senior economist at the World Bank, based in Mexico City now, is the co-founder and still a very close collaborator. The organization has grown from around 30 people that first week to just shy of 1,100 today, and has representatives on every continent except Antarctica. And most of us, a little bit like myself or Diego, are individuals that are actively involved in water management decisions. And we're looking for the best available evidence and knowledge, decision support for how we think about bringing climate perspectives into our personal work, into our institutional work. And we've also really grown at a higher level, and over the last maybe 6-7 years have really moved into global policy areas, making sure that the climate community is aware of the signal role that water plays in meeting climate mitigation and climate adaptation goals. And a lot of that work is really led by SIWI, the Stockholm International Water Institute, and particularly by the co-chair, Maggie White, who is on staff at SIWI.
Hi everyone, just a brief break in this USCA News video cast because there was a small oversight during filming. I forgot that I really wanted to give a strong recommendation, a plug to USCA News viewers and listeners for AGWA's own podcast, which you should listen to if you get a chance. The Climate Ready podcast, Climate Ready is one word, features interviews and segments on emerging trends in the intersection of climate change and water. International experts in policy, engineering, finance and other sectors provide cutting-edge perspectives on climate adaptation advances, challenges and stories, and it's produced by the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. I've been a listener, an eager listener, since Climate Ready launched last year. It's full of interesting stuff. 7 episodes are now available on iTunes and elsewhere, and you can also find links on AGWA's own website, alliance4water.org. And now back to John Matthews of AGWA. So AGWA is an alliance of individuals and institutions.
Exactly, that's exactly right.
The word adaptation is I have a number of questions leading on from asking you to explain Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. What does adaptation mean?
It's a really good question. I actually hate the word. The only word I might hate more than the word adaptation is the word resilience. I think that the words are really useful almost as a way of kind of obscuring meaning. The word adaptation historically really comes from a kind of pure policy community. It's not grounded in say biological knowledge, or it's not grounded in engineering or economics or finance. What I assume that adaptation means is, how is it that we respond to climate impacts that have already happened, or that we think that are going to happen in the future? So that's how we make adjustments in our visions. The resilience is potentially more problematic word, especially in English. It's so variable, but I think it's a closely related word, and often used as a kind of an elegant variation on adaptation. I would say that it really means ensuring that you have systems that are maybe able to autonomously and actively be able to adapt to climate impacts. But I recall very early in my career, I had given a talk in China, and one of my colleagues came up to me after the talk, and he said, it was a really nice talk that you gave about climate adaptation. It was really interesting, but when we were translating it, we really struggled because the word that we normally use for adaptation in Chinese doesn't mean anything in Chinese. It's a really generic vanilla word, and I said, unfortunately, it's the same in English.
But is key to the global discourse around climate and climate change. I think many, I don't like the word lay people, but non-water specialists, water insiders, when they think of climate change and planetary challenges associated with that, the first things that may come to mind are global warming and greenhouse gases and carbon emissions and green energy alternatives. Water's not the first thing that folks think about, but it is where climate change, it's where the rubber meets the road.
That's exactly right, especially in the developed world. Most of the conversation about climate change is about how we slow the rate of climate impacts into the future. We slow down climate change, and that, as a policy term, again, it's a somewhat dissatisfying phrase, is climate mitigation. It doesn't mean how we mitigate impacts. It really refers how we slow down climate change by either reducing the rate at which greenhouse gases enter the atmosphere, or methods in which we might be able to pull down those greenhouse gases somehow and sequester them in maybe natural resources like forests and soils, or that we might be able to even use innovative forms of technology that can somehow scrub the atmosphere of these greenhouse gases. We don't really have much in that latter category. So, and that the term also that has become a bit fashionable is, how do we decarbonize economies? And that's relevant both to the developed world and to the developing world. So for countries like the U.S., for the U.K., we have deeply carbon-intensive economies. We can't get in our cars. We can't even use public transportation without emitting a great deal of greenhouse gases. And making significant shifts in how we organize ourselves is challenging, but it's also a process that is well underway. In the developing world, there's still lots of countries where there are homes that are trying to go from 0 light bulbs to 1 light bulb, or from 1 light bulb to 3 light bulbs. They're really trying to meet very basic energy demand needs, and they're at a stage of development where what Western Europe or North America was maybe in the early or middle of the 19th century, and we're really trying to alleviate poverty and have credible development in those countries. So the decisions for them around climate mitigation are mostly about how they make decisions that don't add unduly to the overall greenhouse gas debt in the atmosphere. So they don't follow the same development trajectory in terms of the types of infrastructure that we did. How is water connected to that? Well, actually, this is a really important policy point. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, is the primary global instrument in how we think about climate policy and both climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And the UNFCCC talks about water as a sector. And what they mean by that is how is it that we supply basic water to households, to businesses and cities and farms. It's really about the kind of most basic aspects of water management. And the Sustainable Development Goals are largely covered by SDG 6. what I think most people who are in the water world, however, recognize intuitively is that water is not just a sector. Water is really an aspect of whole economies. It affects and influences and effectively floats the many aspects of our economy. So energy is a huge one. Almost all aspects of energy are really quite water intensive. Not just hydropower, but most forms of thermal energy. They have to cool their systems, and they primarily use water for that, for coal or natural gas, nuclear, even solar. In most cases, is a thermal system that requires water. And certainly most of the kinds of clean energy systems that we're talking about adding in the future are also very water intensive. Things like biofuels in places like Brazil are incredibly water intensive. So water is really important for energy. It's really important for how we think about agriculture. Many agricultural investments are water-intensive investments. Most of the decisions that we're probably making globally about adaptation are at a city level, and cities have a huge range of water issues that they're trying to think about that they may not necessarily identify as water issues. Things like stormwater, water treatment, supply and storage. They're trying to worry about floods and droughts and how those maybe change out. Certainly coastal sea level rise for a lot of estuarine and coastal cities. Water, in that sense, is a thematic issue. It's a connector for many other types of sectors.
And do you feel, you mentioned the UNFCCC, which will cross viewers' news horizons with the annual COP events, in particular the conference 2 years ago, which provided the occasion for the Paris Agreement on climate change. You're a veteran of these events, of the conventions of parties, gatherings, and you carry the flag, you and your colleagues, for the argument that water is cross-cutting and deserves to be treated differently from just another sector. You've also written a very reflective and entertaining article for USCA News, which is published on our website and newsletters this week. In fact, viewers can visit www.uscanews.com, and I certainly recommend that a quick read of John's article about the recent COP event in Bonn, Germany, would be a helpful accompaniment to this conversation. We'll come on to Bonn shortly, John, but you've described to me in the past that there has been a journey in terms of these very large climate conferences, in terms of getting water up the agenda, the climate agenda, the global policy agenda, and getting water to be understood as this connector. What changes have you seen as you attend these annual events and mix with the great and the good climate poobahs?
I've seen a remarkable amount of change. My very first COP was in 2009. It was a very kind of a famous COP, the Copenhagen COP, COP15, and it was, I think by most standards, it was a debacle at a policy level, and it was very confusing to me. There was something like 35 or 40,000 people, mostly trapped by snow and renegade policymakers who didn't want to come to firm decisions. And I was one of a very small number of people who was arguing actually water is really important to meet these climate mitigation goals, these climate adaptation goals. You need to think about the water commitments that you are effectively making. I remember I was sitting in a panel at COP15, and Brazil had sent a massive delegation, around 650 people, to that delegation, and I was the person in the panel that was talking about this important role of water. And this Brazilian delegate raised his hand, he stood up and he said, out of 650 people from Brazil here, I am the only one who is thinking about water. And I think that is, especially for a country like Brazil, that is a critical gap in how we make policy. Now, the good news is that remarkable amount of change has happened since 2009. In the COP that occurred in, I believe it was 2014, COP 20 in Lima, Peru, we had co-organized an event where we had arranged a panel. There was a deputy mayor from Paris. There was the head of the scientific a team for the UNFCCC, the IPCC, Regina Pachuri on the panel. There were representatives from aid agencies and private companies. So all stood on this panel, and they all said, water is central to meeting our climate goals. And we need to make sure that we're managing water in a resilient way in order to meet those climate goals. And we need to make sure that our climate goals recognize the critical role that the water plays. These are mutual communities that need to work together. But the one person in that panel that did not support it was a representative of the UNFCCC secretariat.
Really?
And he literally said, water is a sector. It's a sector like energy, like forests, like cities, and we just need to treat it in the same level with that. Water is about pipes and pumps, and you people need to be quiet and go back to your box.
Well, how do you deal with that sort of response?
Well, I was really struck that he wasn't even really listening to his peers, and the UNFCCC, it's an institution that needs to reflect the needs and desires of its members, and so our work and the work of many others has really been to reach out, especially to the national governments. These annual meetings for the UNFCCC, COP stands for Conference of the Parties, and a party is a signatory. It's a national government. So what we've done very assiduously is try to cultivate, identify, and collaborate, and ultimately support these national parties and how they articulate the significance of these issues. So the difference between Lima and Paris the next year in 2015, when the French government was the host, was massive.
So Paris was a big moment for water. It was a big moment for the Paris Agreement. But for water in particular, folks started paying attention.
That's exactly right. The French government played an enormous role in that process. Each year there's a government that acts as the host for the COP, and they're not supposed to influence the discussions, but what they can do that is important is they can help set the agenda, they can order that agenda, and they can also, through their organizational capabilities, they can help highlight certain issues. And one of the issues that they chose very effectively to point out was that of water. And they organized a couple of events, one in the kind of delegate and government zone and one in the public zone that were focused on this critical role of water. On the side of the water community, we helped organized what can only be described as a grassroots movement called the hashtag Climate is Water movement. We had hundreds, close to 1,000 people that attended the Climate is Water event that day. It was really impressive, and on the delegate side, the government side, the stature of the people that were involved, up to the environment minister for France, were really active. They showed that their very high level of support for making sure that the water community is supporting climate goals, and that the climate community is recognizing this critical role that water plays more generally. So that was a huge breakthrough.
Did the momentum, the prioritization and profile of water in Paris, you credit the French government organisers, but also talk about it being bottom up and grassroots, a bit of both, I guess.
It very much so. For instance, the Climate is Water event was largely funded by a company. It's funded by Arup, a large British engineering firm, and they moderated the event, but they didn't set the agenda. And you had representatives from the European Investment Bank, the EIB, from a wide range of NGOs, from many governments that were standing up in that event and saying, we need to do a better job about recognizing how these two communities, the water and climate communities, can work and collaborate more effectively together. This is what our institution is doing. This is what we feel like we need to keep doing, and we need the UNFCCC to help support us in that process.
And the momentum seems to have continued. There have been two subsequent conventions of parties in Marrakesh last year, and more recently in Bonn. Water's getting its say at last.
I completely agree with that. Morocco was the next COP. The Moroccan government worked very closely and collaboratively with the French government and their organization, and they actually sponsored with the World Water Council a second meeting that occurred between the COPs. The COPs typically occur in November or December. This is a meeting that happened in July 2016 in Morocco. Maybe 600 or 700 people attended this meeting, and I think it had something like 24 African ministers there alone. It was an impressive meeting to help mobilize especially the water community so that we spoke much more clearly and more effectively about the set of issues and how we engage with climate change. The COP last year was officially sponsored by Fiji, a Pacific Island nation, but their facilities obviously were quite limited. So Germany co-organized the meeting with them and also acted as a kind of secondary supporting and enabling host. So the meeting was actually held in Bonn, Germany. And the German government in particular played an absolutely critical role, and notably with a lot of participation from the French government and the Moroccan government, and the Dutch government has also been instrumental in supporting these issues more generally.
So, moving in the right direction, the difficulty, not just for us as the world of water, but broadly for the climate change community, is the problem of what can a huge conference achieve apart from everybody getting round and saying woe is me. Now the one COP that I attended in Marrakesh, it was impressive, the water profile. There was a full water day of action, and a vibe that water was more than a sector, and that the connector argument was landing. There was a policy paper, a blue book published subsequent or towards the end of the conference, and I know that Uska News reported there was a similar document produced post Bonn towards the end of 2017. So, day of action and a book. The difficulty for us is very interested in your view. How do you measure the tangibles that are coming out of the good noises?
That is exactly the right question, and I would say that our challenge, at least from the time that I really became involved in 2009, and arguably from other colleagues for much longer than that, going back maybe another 6 or 8 years before that, the initial challenge was one of awareness.
Sure.
What is the role of water in supporting UNFCCC goals? Can UNFCCC also support resilient water management more generally? And I think the I would say strong toehold that we saw in Paris in 2015 that really blossomed into a very active community in 2016, and continued into a day-long series of connected events in 2017 in Bonn, involving over 100 speakers and dozens of different institutions, all really speaking with one voice, and also seeing a real institutionalization of these issues inside the UNFCCC, that they're not an obstacle anymore. They're helping us to organize these processes actually. So that awareness issue, in a sense, it definitely needs to continue. It needs to move forward. It also, I think that your question is the correct one. What does this translate into? What does it look like next? And so that's a shift from awareness into specific actions, specific recommendations. And I would say that we made a really bold start during the final stages of the Water Action Day, the UNFCCC Water Action Day in Bonn. There were a couple of representatives, notably Antonio Cañas, a representative from El Salvador, so he's one of the parties who reports to a minister, and also Ulrika Poporsky de Cunha, with the GIZ, and part of the German government, and she's one of the water leads inside of the German government, and works on a lot of development aid and development support on behalf of the government. And both of them gave a really, I think, well-argued and very programmatic suggestions about how we think explicitly about UNFCCC institutions and UNFCCC processes that where water needs to be present. For instance, one of the big changes that's happened in UNFCCC since the Paris Agreement is that individual countries need to prepare effectively a 5-year plan that says, here's what we're going to do for climate mitigation and climate adaptation at our national level. Who prepares these documents? They really come from national governments, from fairly high levels, often ministries for foreign affairs, or say the State Department in the US. They don't come necessarily from resource management institutions, or certainly from water managers. They don't come from ministries of finance. So these are not actually decision-making abilities. The parties that have to actually fulfill those requirements, that meet those goals, There are other national level ministries and agencies. There are also lots of NGOs. There are city governments. There are many other kinds of entities that actually need to connect with those national goals. And I think that these national commitments, they're called NDCs, nationally determined contributions, that they could be one of the most powerful vehicles for how we think about what I would call water coherence. How we make sure that as we do actions to ensure effective climate mitigation and climate adaptation, that we're trying to think about the role of water, not just at that asset or that investment level, at that project scale, but also across the full range of water users, across a wide range of policies. Imagine, for instance, like if you needed to go take out a loan to buy a house, and your bank said, you need to think about your full environmental footprint, about how your household is going to use electricity, how it's going to use water, and do kind of a full environmental assessment of that house. That'd be a really powerful vehicle for mainstreaming a wide range of issues. And so what we've heard as some of the, I think, kind of next stage suggestions, thinking forward the next year, 2, maybe even 3 years in the UNFCCC, is how can we kind of harness some of these processes to make sure that say a clean energy project, that it's actually starting to look at what are the sustainabilities, the resilience of their water supplies in order to meet their climate mitigation goals. Are they looking at transboundary water resources and coordinating at that level? Are they looking at other water-intensive sectors? Do they have enough storage? Are they considering nature-based solutions and so on? And then those are it's a more sophisticated approach. It's a very different approach. Maybe it's not sexy marketing, as opposed to our awareness work over the past few COPs. But I think it's the necessary next set of steps that we have to take.
Thank you very much, John. The next necessary steps that we have to take. Thank you too very much for watching or listening to this USCA News webcast. Our guest today, Dr. John Matthews, joined us from Oregon in the US for the cast. He is co-founder and secretariat coordinator of the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, AGWA. My name is David Duncan from USCA News. I hope you'll be able to join us next time.